So are you going to follow the rules? Or are you going to follow your instincts? I'm not sure it matters because either way, we are descending into madness with this one. All right, let me say up front, this video ultimately is just for me. I have no clue if anybody else cares or is curious about the 1992 box office bomb that is Cool World, but I have been fascinated by it for 30 years now. I actually don't remember when I first saw it all the way through. It wasn't in the theater, at I guess it was probably video rental, 94, maybe 95. Before I committed to this video, I hadn't rewatched it since whenever I watched it the first time. Yet, I remembered way more of this film than I should, and the trailer's been burned into my memory for quite a while.
You're about to make an unscheduled trip to the other side. Buster.
I'm more than overdue to unravel this tangled web of misguided development, chaotic shooting, and bizarre final film that resulted from it. So let's talk about it. Cool World is an animation and live-action hybrid film helmed by cult animation director and possible madman Ralph Bakshi. It cost $28 million to make and brought in returns of just over half that. Critics absolutely savaged it.
Here was a movie where you could often see the seams, and they were not particularly convincing.
Oh, absolutely. You could see the seams.
And it currently holds a 4% on Rotten Tomatoes. It was called a one-joke movie, too serious to be fun, too goofy to take seriously, surprisingly incompetent, and a Roger Corman version of Roger Rabbit. Now, I should be clear about my intentions here. I'm not here to defend this film because it's most certainly not some critically misunderstood gem with hidden depths that weren't appreciated at the time. I'm not sure I'd even say it's so bad that it's good, like how one might describe something like The Room or The Happening.
What? No.
But I still want to pull it apart because it fails in ways that are bizarre and unique and worth examining and worth trying to figure out why did that happen. But before we can really get into this, there is one major complication that needs to be addressed when it comes to talking about this movie, more particularly when talking about the making of it, because it was made prior to the rise of internet movie culture. Things like What I Do. And in fact, it actually came out at a time when many households didn't even have internet access. So there wasn't much that was documented or archived about the making of this film. DVDs wouldn't be around for a few more years, so if there ever was much in the way of behind-the-scenes documentation of the making of, there really wasn't much reason to keep it because there were no extras on VHS tapes, and it wasn't a liked movie, so it wasn't like they were going to get a TV special on how it was made. Because it was such a notorious bomb, very few people involved in the film at any level appear to ever want to talk about it, even to this day. The one person who is more than happy to talk about it is director Ralph Bakshi. Now, the thing is, under normal circumstances, that might be enough to go with in terms of trying to figure out how this film ended up the way it did. In this case, it's kind of a problem because Bakshi has a long-established reputation for, let's go with flamboyant exaggeration. For example, when talking about the making of his animated Lord of the Rings film, Bakshi has claimed that he had
3,000 people in the studio back in New York animating,
when realistically it would have been around maybe 70. But that's why I say prone to exaggeration instead of lying, because when you drill down into Bakshi's various wild claims that he's let loose over the decades, you can usually find an original nugget of truth that has been distorted in the telling and the retelling, sometimes to, frankly, comical degrees. That's why trying to find out what really happened in the development and shooting of this film is so difficult. Because if you were to say, look at the Wikipedia entry on it, the source for most of the claims, which aren't really challenged, they come from interviews with Bakshi himself, and virtually no corroboration or secondary sources on most of these things. It probably doesn't help that since the release of Cool World, Bakshi's been various degrees of retired. He's popped up now and then with smaller productions, almost entirely outside of the major forces in Hollywood. He worked briefly with HBO on a series called Spicy City in '97, but when the network wanted to replace his in-house writing staff with Hollywood writers for a second season, Bakshi flatly refused, and he really hasn't touched anything close to a major studio or network production since. In other words, he has no reason to be polite or rein in his exaggerations because he doesn't have to worry about maintaining good relationships with anybody in the industry. Now, honestly, I'm not sure the man ever gave a single solitary fuck, but if he did, he's had no reason to hold on to it for the last 25 years. The upshot of this is that I'm honestly pretty doubtful about a fair amount of the information I'm going to be sharing with you about the development and production of this movie. There is ultimately going to be a bit more speculation on my part than I'm normally comfortable doing, largely just by my trying to figure out what that original nugget of truth is underneath all of Bakshi's bonkers claims. Ultimately, most of these are going to be guesses on my part, but they have to be, because that's all I've got. So with the preamble out of the way, what even is Cool World? Cool World starts out with a painfully generic opening credit sequence that practically screams, we had no money left by the time we got to this part. And it then launches into what is effectively a prologue scene in 1945, where the character Frank Harris, played by a not yet broken through to stardom Brad Pitt, returns from serving in World War II and decides to celebrate by taking his mother for a joyride on a motorcycle. They get into an accident, his mother dies, and Frank is transported to the cartoon Cool World, thanks to an invention called the Spike, created by a cartoon scientist called Doc Whiskers. This is probably the point where I should warn you to not look for much logic behind most of what I'm going to be telling you, because if there ever was any, it got buried under nonsense along the way. Events jump ahead to then present-day 1992, where Jack Deebs, played by Gabriel Byrne, is in prison for murdering a man he caught sleeping with his wife. Deebs has been passing his time in prison, drawing various characters and aspects of Cool World, which are being published as a comic book while he finishes out his sentence. Oh, and just in case you're wondering how things like Frank being a World War II veteran or his mother dying or Jack's history of violence factor into the story, they don't. Like, at all. At a guess, maybe the reason for Frank to come from the 1940s might be there to serve as kind of an in-universe explanation for him behaving like an outdated grizzled noir stock character. Though if that's the case, it's odd that the film felt the need to give context to that when there's so little context for most of what else goes on in it. And even if you feel that works, the film loses almost 10 minutes on introducing Frank with his barely relevant backstory, so it's a misplaced priority at best. And as for Jack being in jail at the start, I honestly can't think of a single reason why that's there. His history never really factors into things, and the idea that he's violently jealous could have come up with later stuff very easily, but it just doesn't. At a guess, it's an aspect that probably mattered in an earlier draft, but the reasons for having it eventually were no longer there, and the backstory stuck around despite no longer being useful, like an appendix or a vestigial tale. Anyways, for the last decade in prison, Jack's been having visions of Cool World and the people in it, with a particular focus on one Hollywood, voiced and later on in the film portrayed in the flesh by Kim Basinger. Soon after Jack is released from prison, he gets pulled into the Cool World. This is where we learn that Frank is serving as a cop there along with his inept partner Niles, who's a spider, because why not? Their primary job is to prevent Noids, which is a slang term for humans, from having sex with Doodles, the cartoon denizens of Cool World. Naturally, there is an inherent conflict here, since Holly really wants to get it on with the Noid because that's the plot of the movie. I've kind of headcanon at this point that Holly is a dedicated hedonist who's gone through whatever pleasure there is to be had in the Cool World and craves new, real experiences. That's not really in the text, but that's what makes sense in my head. Naturally, Jack's an easy target since he's been lusting after her ever since he first got visions of her and started drawing her. So of course, they get it on, and somehow this turns Holly human, and she escapes to the real world with Jack. But her transformation is unstable, and both she and Jack start to flash back and forth between Noid and Doodle forms. Holly goes on a search for the spike that caused the original tear between the two worlds, which she believes was brought over to the real world by a Doodle decades ago. Actually turns out that she was right, and she runs into a disguised Doc Whiskers, learns that the spike is placed atop a hotel. Believing it'll stabilize her real flesh form, she goes after it. By now, Frank has realized what's happened and is in the real world teaming up with Jack to try and stop her. Holly knocks Frank off a building to his death and takes control of the spike, but instead of stabilizing her form, it instead allows the cool world to pour into the real world and start transforming it into just cartoon madness. Despite this being nearly the exact opposite of what Holly has wanted up to this point, she appears to be supervillain levels of gleeful about all this. Jack gets turned into a cartoon superhero, and after a few minutes of just chaos, he returns the spike to the cool world, which pulls back all the Doodles, undoes the damage, and plugs up the tear between universes. Frank's body is also returned to the cool world, where we suddenly learn that if a Noid is killed by a Doodle, they become a Doodle. For some reason. Well, the reason is that this gives Frank a happy ending, as he's finally able to get close to his Doodle love interest he could never get freaky with before, and who I forgot to bring up in all the chaos of this. It also kind of begs the question why he didn't just have some Doodle kill him years ago, since he states plainly earlier in the film that he never wants to go back to the real world anyways, but whatever, we're just about done. It wraps up with one quick scene of Jack and Holly together, him a blissful idiot and her utterly miserable. Roll the credits. Now, along the way in all this, we have the constant clash of cartoon violence with disturbing settings and wooden live action performances from actors who seem very lost. Every now and then, the clashing elements fit together in fun ways.
Those big bad guys didn't play fair. I want you to tear and rip their miserable faces inside until their mother doesn't recognize them.
But such moments are countered by weirdness that doesn't seem to have any purpose, not even its own sake. And sections that also go on much longer than they can support. The entire bit where Holly is in Vegas is the worst of this. Now, at a more svelte runtime of, say, 90 minutes, it could have kept up the pace enough for the chaos to just be a madcap roller coaster that occasionally flings riders off in random directions. But at 102 minutes, it drags in the back end right up until a brick is put on the accelerator and it careens off a cliff. So how the heck did this happen? Here we get into trying to sort out the behind the scenes. So let's start with what's pretty safely assumed to be true. In 1990, after Ralph Bakshi approached Paramount Studios, which was an organization he had ties to from his time in their long-defunct in-house animation studio, he went and he pitched an animation live-action hybrid called Cool World, which the studio jumped on almost certainly because of the runaway success of Who Framed Roger Rabbit 2 years prior. Now, Bakshi himself had wanted to try something like this a while ago, decades actually. Back in the 70s, the original intention for his film Hey Good Lookin' was to have animated characters and live-action actors interact. However, the film proved too difficult and costly to be completed as originally intended, ultimately being released in '82 as a wholly animated production. Now, at the point that he approached Paramount, Bakshi himself hadn't made a theatrical film since 1983's Fire and Ice, which is a movie that I actually would say is so bad it's good. It's immensely riffable. Pour some drinks, see it with friends. But since '83, he'd only done a handful of TV specials and shorts, such as the underappreciated adaptation of Dr. Seuss's similarly underappreciated The Butter Battle Book. Seuss himself said it was the most faithful adaptation of his work out of all the TV specials that had been done in his lifetime. But the point is, Bakshi hadn't worked on anything of notable scale in quite a while, and Cool World was hugely ambitious, even with Roger Rabbit having already proven the commercial viability of mixing animation and live action. So what was Bakshi's actual story pitch? Well, here's where things start getting murky, because even in a rush to copy the success of Roger Rabbit with an animation veteran at the helm, I have a hard time imagining Paramount going with what Bakshi currently claims was his original pitch. Bakshi has said his initial plan was for an animated horror film with the primary focus on a half-real, half-cartoon offspring of a cartoonist in a drawing, who would grow to resent their human father and attempt to kill him. According to Bakshi, while he was off working on pre-production and set building, the producer, one Frank Mancuso Jr., brought in new writers on the script, and when Bakshi showed up on the first day of actual production, he was handed a completely different script from the one he had been prepping for. Bakshi claims to have actually punched Mancuso Jr. in the mouth over this.
I had a huge fight with the guy and punched Mancuso Jr. in the mouth.
Makes for a good story, but this whole writing of a supposedly new script is one of the few points that we have some degree of secondary sourcing on, as Michael Grace, one of the credited screenwriters, gave an interview with Slash Film a few years ago, and he gave his side of the story. Now, according to Grace, he and his writing partner at the time, Mark Victor, were contacted by Mancuso Jr. and brought in because Bakshi had come to Paramount with the concept of an animated live-action hybrid horror film, but no actual plot or story pitch to speak of. Grace said that when he and Victor came up with the core story of a cartoonist pulled into a cartoon world, that Bakshi was more than happy with that concept. As for the punching the producer, well, there was undoubtedly tension during production and issues with the direction of the film, and it's safe to say that Bakshi and Mancuso Jr. clashed at some points. Though, I'm disinclined to believe changes were suddenly sprung on Bakshi out of nowhere, or that it ever came to blows. Even with scattered information on behind-the-scenes situation, there's plenty of telltale signs in the film itself that things were changing as it was happening, to some degree, just probably not as drastically as Bakshi is claiming. Probably the biggest tell is the backgrounds and the landscapes of Cool World, which are dark, twisted, disturbing, and highly detailed. They feel very much like something done early into production when the film was intended to be more adult and horror themed, but as the film lurched forward and moved away from horror into a cartoonishly sexualized PG-13, there was neither the time nor the money to redo all the backgrounds, and so they just stayed there, looming over everything as a marker of some earlier intention. Or at least that would certainly explain why the backgrounds don't really fit with anything else going on. One of the interesting quirks of the film is that it starts out with a slightly odd but largely understandable premise and gets stranger and stranger as it goes along. The conclusion in particular feels like an unraveling of logic to the point that one could be forgiven if they thought that descending into madness was actually the overriding intent of the film. That is, however, extremely doubtful, as another of the better verified aspects of the production is that Grace and Victor were having a difficult time cracking the ending. To use Grace's own words,
we couldn't figure out how this f***ing thing ended.
So Mancuso Jr. brought in Larry Gross, best known at the time for the film's 48 Hours and its sequel, and he tried to handle the third act. So odds are that the complete chaos of the last 15 minutes or so are a result of trying to cap off a production that was probably very loose and chaotic from the word go. Bakshi has a pretty well-earned reputation as an animation director for not caring that much about consistency. As someone who'd worked his way up from bottom-level grunt work at age 18, he reveled in letting his animators stretch their wings and giving shots to people with limited experience.
I hired guys who were just workmen, whom didn't think they were great.
That's certainly laudable in its way, but it does mean that it's not uncommon in his films for things to shift stylistically from scene to scene, or for characters to appear like they're from completely different productions. Sometimes this works, like in his early slice of city living films like Heavy Traffic, where the mixture of visual style and quality feels reflective of the crowded urban setting and story, being set in a city that is just as chaotic and mismatched as the animation styles. However, that same element feels more out of place in anything trying to tell an actual coherent, overarching, or thematically resonant story. Cool World suffers from Bakshi's everybody gets a shot and go ahead, just try whatever you want approach in a few odd ways. For instance, the idea of an animator just doing some weird thing and it didn't have a place in the film, but Bakshi wanted to throw it in anyways. The only explanation I can think of for something like this, or this,
Don't you see? They're real.
most prominently though, there's a very distinct style disconnect between Hollywood and basically everything else. This one might have actually been on purpose, since Holly, and to a lesser extent Frank's girlfriend Lynette, are meant to be appealing in a pin-up sort of way. And I should be clear about this, Holly is honestly stunningly animated, and not just from a voyeuristic male gaze perspective, although... yeah, there is that. My point is, though, that her movement is smooth, appealing. She stands out from the chaos, as she should. But when we get to the climax and everything goes crazy, the whole thing suddenly feels reminiscent of some of the more visually disjointed moments in some of Bakshi's other films like Wizards, where Bakshi himself said that he just told his animators to draw Mutant doing something funny and he would just slap whatever they did into the film. Mixed up in this is the bizarre fact that when Holly flashes back and forth between Noid and Doodle forms, she's not flashing into Holly, but like a clown? And at the end, when the spike gets put back, this happens, despite her never having had that level of cartoonishness before. Heck, her mouth doesn't even move during some of her lines at the climax.
Oh, please.
Which, in animation especially, is a definite sign of things either being rushed or changed late into production. So the ending feels less like a deliberate choice to become nonsensical than it does a handful of creatives throwing their hands up and saying, I don't know, you figure it out, to each other. I haven't really talked about the integration of the animation and the live action, and while it was undoubtedly a massive technical hurdle, it didn't automatically have to be a big stumbling block. Even setting aside Bakshi's aborted attempt with the aforementioned Hey Good Looking, Bakshi had been working with live actors to varying degrees for decades. He'd become partial to rotoscoping and reference footage in the late 70s through the early 80s. So on paper, this shouldn't have been that much of a leap, except it very clearly was. And this is where we need to bring in the inevitable comparison to Roger Rabbit, because with that film, there's a reason that the film's director was not also the head of the animation department. Robert Zemeckis put a great deal of faith into animation director Richard Williams, but he also understood that it was his job to make things as smooth as possible for Williams to work with. This is why the raw footage of Roger Rabbit before the animation overlay is rife with special effects artists puppeteering objects as well as the use of motion control cameras to ensure that shots moved in the exact same way for every take so that the animation never appeared to jump out of place or fail to move with the camera the way that a filmed object would. While I can't find out a ton of reliable information on the filming process of Cool World, just the fact that it had little more than half the budget of Roger Rabbit, that would indicate there wasn't the time or the resources to recreate the same kind of meticulous production. If Bakshi would even have wanted to do it that way, and given his usual work style, I'd say that's a long shot. One telltale sign of less resources is the fact that in the Cool World, much of the sets that the actors interact with are 2D props and backdrops, probably to ensure that they only had to do blue screen compositing when absolutely necessary. And that's fine to be using these flats as far as a cost-cutting measure goes, except that the camera moves in such a way as to draw attention to the fact that many of the sets are literally just painted flats. There's even some truly weird things like Frank's car, which flips between being fully animated, a real practical car, and a flat 2D standee of a car from shot to shot. There's also a stiffness to the actors' performances, probably owing to how much they were either standing on empty sets or against blue screen backdrops. Now, blue screen or green screen, more used now, it's a very common practice today, as pretty much any movie with a budget of over $70 million is going to involve the actors acting in, with, or against nothing. But in the early 90s, most actors didn't really know how to make that work, simply because they hadn't had to do it before. It wasn't normal. And it probably didn't help that of all the things that have been said about Bakshi, positive and negative, nobody's ever described him as an actor's director. Speaking of the actors, that's another area where Bakshi said some things that are tricky to parse with reality. Bakshi claims he never wanted Basinger in the role. He said in interviews conducted in the years since that he wanted Drew Barrymore, which is a curious claim given that at the time of filming she would have been 15 or 16 years old. And the idea of a minor playing Holly is unsettling. Now, to give at least the option for benefit of the doubt, it's possible that what he really meant was he wanted Barrymore to play whatever the original concept for Holly was, possibly even meaning he wanted her to be the half-human, half-cartoon murderer he originally had in his initial pitch, assuming that there is validity to that. That at least would track a little bit better, as Barrymore had started dipping into horror not long after her breakout in E.T. back in '82. But again, it's hard to know how much stock to put into what Bakshi claims was his original pitch in the first place, so who even knows? But even setting that aside, Bakshi's words toward Basinger seem to indicate the two did not exactly gel on set. Bakshi claims that she wanted to tone the movie down, stating,
Kim wanted a PG film to show in hospitals so she could get a good reputation.
What does that even mean? Movies don't get screened in hospitals. If they want something for patients to see, they just turn on the TV. But even beyond that, saying that she needed a good reputation that's a weird claim too. Like, at the time this film was released, Basinger was easily the biggest star out of the three leads. And while it's true she first got big with more risque material like 9.5 Weeks, she was in Batman in 1989, which, as dark as it was largely considered to be a family film. She didn't need a reputation boost. But as per usual, there's probably a crumb of truth in there somewhere, if we dig. Bakshi probably always wanted to make an R-rated film. That seems safe to assume, if for no other reason than adult material was his comfort zone. Even the man's family film, Wizards, which I have a soft spot for, but has a lot of problems. That movie features graphic violence and Nazi imagery. And it seems like there was definitely tension between Bakshi and the studio about how far he could push this, since Paramount, as best as I could find, always wanted this to have a PG-13 rating at most. And if Bakshi was pushing the boundaries, or at least trying to, and Basinger was among the voices trying to reel him in, well, that seems like it could be the much more believable crumb of truth underneath the PG film to show in hospitals claim.
Kim, I think that's wonderful, but you've got the wrong guy to do that with.
It's worth remembering that in 1992, PG-13 rating was still relatively new. It got introduced in '86, but the general sense of what was allowed was starting to solidify by this point. And Cool World was definitely pushing at the limits with its basic concept alone. I mean, the entire central conceit is based around not only two characters having sex despite explicit warnings not to, and in the case of one of them wanting to do it for selfish and borderline nefarious reasons, but it also talks openly about the fact that that's what's going on. And honestly, having now rewatched it, I'm less surprised that the concept squeaked through with a PG-13 than I am at the fact that it did so while being devoid of subtext.
Noids do not have sex with Doodles.
Just as a quick comparison, Roger Rabbit coded sexual innuendo with allusions to things like playing patty cake. But Cool World, they just say it.
Noids do not have sex with Doodles.
This kind of naked acknowledgement of adult lust didn't really happen in PG-13 movies, though the fact that one of the two characters in question is animated might have been what helped it secure that rating. But regardless, I have little doubt that Bakshi wanted to do much more than he was ultimately permitted to do. And keep in mind, he was permitted to include shots like these. And given all that, I would not be shocked if Basinger at some point in the process expressed some concerns about the direction, but I genuinely have a hard time believing she wanted to turn it into a PG film. I think she knew at least generally what she signed on for, at least as much as anybody involved did. But the reality is we'll probably never know for sure what went on in the development, shooting, or even the animation process of Cool World that resulted in this absolutely bizarre film, because the simple truth is that nearly everybody involved wants to pretend like it never happened, and the only one willing to talk is probably the single least reliable source available. So what does that leave us in trying to understand this thing? Well, it leaves us with a deeply bizarre film that is probably not really worth seeing for anybody other than those with an interest in failed oddities, but for whatever reason, it's something my brain has never been able to shake for the last 30 years. Whether that means it did something right or did something so wrong that it's impossible to forget, well, I guess you'd have to see it for yourself to judge, if you don't mind feeling like a drunk animation buff is screaming directly into your brain for about 100 minutes. But that's Cool World. It is something else. And I have a number of I'm not sure how deep a dive this was, but these sorts of examinations of things that are intriguing to me that I've wanted to do for a bit. And I actually put it up as a poll on my Patreon. You can support me there and get to vote in polls like this, where I asked people, I didn't tell them what movies or TV shows I was thinking of. Like, okay, do you want me to rip into something? Do you want me to praise something that I think doesn't get enough attention? Or do you want me to examine something that's just weird? They voted for the weird, and you get Cool World. So any help you can give on the Patreon is of immense support. It's what allows me to do this as my living and have a new video up for you every single Saturday. But even if you can't do that, like, share, subscribe also help. And more than anything, whatever your thoughts on this movie are, drop them down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I want to hear if anybody else remembers this thing, or if hearing me talk about it encourages people to check it out for themselves. I want to hear what your experience was. But the thing that I really want you to remember, more than anything, is that you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Just remember,
Noids do not have sex with Doodles.
God, this thing is so weird. Time to give my thanks to my highest supporting patrons. That would include Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Theotha Boyd, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Adam RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Shaylee Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want your name said while these guys try and distract me, consider looking at the rewards on my Patreon.